"Sir, your badge is not scanning." That was what the security guard at the front lobby desk said to me, looking confused and slightly embarrassed as I stood at the turnstile entrance of Aection Technologies. I had walked into that glass tower every single weekday morning for 8 straight years. I was not late. I was not nursing a hangover. I was not carrying a designer smoothie like some of the junior executives who strolled in at 10 o'clock. I was 51 years old, wearing my standard gray wool suit, holding my leather briefcase in one hand and a quarterly compliance folder in the other. I was fully prepared to present our federal risk assessment to the executive committee, but the turnstile barrier refused to unlock. I chuckled softly, assuming it was a temporary system glitch, and asked Mark to swipe my card once more. He tried 3 separate times, but the red light blinked steadily. Then he picked up his desk phone and made a quiet call to Human Resources. 10 minutes later, Evelyn Price, the Human Resources Director, stepped out of the private executive elevator. She was a woman who had come to my office 2 years prior, begging for help on her personal mortgage compliance verification when her loan application was stalled due to improper documentation. Today, her face was completely blank. She possessed that rehearsed, tight-lipped expression reserved for corporate terminations. She told me softly that we needed to speak in a private conference room on the second floor. Inside, she placed a thick beige envelope on the polished wooden table. She explained that due to structural realignment, my position as Senior Compliance Risk Officer was being eliminated, effective immediately. No prior performance warnings had ever been issued. No transition period was offered. There was only a cold checklist of offboarding protocols and an itemized demand for the immediate return of all corporate assets. I handed over my encrypted laptop and company cell phone before 3 o'clock that afternoon. They made sure to make the experience as petty as humanly possible. On my final payroll statement, they deducted $185.50 for an unreturned accessory. It turned out I had forgotten to pack a cheap neoprene laptop sleeve that had been sitting under my desk for 3 years. The $14,000 severance check they handed me was already taxed and thoroughly insulting given my tenure. My team had just achieved 135% of its quarterly key performance indicators. We were 8 months ahead of our internal audit schedule, and our federal vendor compliance framework had received an official commendation from independent regulators just 3 weeks ago. Yet here I was, 51 years old, being escorted off the premises by a junior security assistant half my age who still wrote passwords on Post-it notes. I did not raise my voice, nor did I slam any doors. I simply looked at Evelyn Price and asked who would be taking over the risk management framework I had spent nearly a decade building. She gave me a practiced, corporate smile and claimed that the department was not replacing me, but rather streamlining operational oversight under executive leadership. Later that evening, a trusted colleague called to tell me the real truth behind the sudden decision. My entire department had been folded directly under Spencer Thornton, the Vice President of Corporate Strategy, and handed to his 26-year-old nephew, Chad Thornton. This was the same Chad Thornton who had once submitted a federal regulatory report with basic legal terms, misspelled multiple times, and who regularly missed morning strategy briefings to play golf. I walked across the parking lot to my sedan in absolute silence, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal with every step. I sat behind the wheel for 20 minutes, staring at the corporate logo on the building facade. I remembered every weekend sacrificed, every midnight audit session, and every time I had quietly corrected major executive oversights without taking public credit. I had given 8 years of my life to protecting Aection Technologies from federal fines, and my reward was a beige envelope and a deduction for a cheap computer sleeve. When I logged into my mobile banking app, my total savings stood at $14,210.50. I had no active job offers, no executive references, and an overwhelming sense of anger that I kept tightly controlled behind my teeth. I spent the next 3 weeks submitting applications across the industry, but word had clearly spread through executive circles. Spencer Thornton had quietly let it be known that my departure was tied to performance irregularities during a second quarter audit, casting a dark cloud over my professional reputation. Out of 54 applications, 44 companies ghosted me completely while the remaining sent polite automated rejections. By mid-February, after paying my mortgage and health insurance out of pocket, my financial safety net was shrinking rapidly. I realized that my former corporate network was entirely useless when faced with executive slander and corporate nepotism. I sat in my small kitchen evening after evening, organizing my financial records and calculating how long my remaining savings would last. I reviewed my professional certifications, noting that every single statutory accreditation was current and fully verified by national compliance boards. The unfairness of the situation burned deeply, but I refused to let despair dictate my actions. I knew that in the corporate world, emotional outbursts achieved nothing, whereas legal precision and statutory knowledge were formidable assets. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, I applied for an entry-level position that I would have overlooked a year ago. It was a junior regulatory analyst role at the Federal Bureau of Corporate Compliance. The position offered $16 an hour, no corporate perks, and required sitting in a basement office reviewing dry statutory filings. But it came with official federal credentials and direct access to regulatory enforcement databases. When the hiring director called me 48 hours later, she noted that my background appeared vastly overqualified for the grade level. I told her plainly that I understood statutory frameworks from the inside out and wanted to learn how federal enforcement mechanisms operated from the top down. She approved my clearance paperwork, and I started the following Monday, determined to master the regulatory system. The transition from a plush corporate office to a windowless federal cubicle was jarring, but it provided an invaluable perspective on corporate governance and regulatory power. My direct supervisor at the Bureau was Eleanor Hughes, a veteran regulatory lead with 30 years of government service. She was a stern, brilliant woman who wore muted gray suits and managed enforcement dockets with surgical precision. Eleanor did not care about corporate titles, executive swagger, or polished slideshow presentations. She cared about verifiable audit trails, statutory compliance under federal law, and exact legal language. During my first few months, while younger interns complained about the repetitive nature of reviewing corporate disclosures, I immersed myself completely in the mechanics of statutory enforcement. I spent long hours studying federal statutes, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106, regarding the protection and misattribution of proprietary intellectual work, alongside federal acquisition regulations governing corporate transparency. I learned how corporate executives frequently manipulated internal document timestamps, how backdated non-disclosure agreements were used to conceal executive self-dealing, and how escrow buffer clauses could be leveraged to pause massive corporate mergers. Eleanor recognized my intense focus and began assigning me to complex due diligence investigations involving regional tech mergers. She taught me that corporate entities rarely collapse because of external market pressure. They collapse because executive arrogance leads them to create sloppy, fraudulent paper trails that they assume no independent auditor will ever scrutinize. Day after day, I sat beneath flickering fluorescent lights in the bureau basement, mastering the exact legal mechanisms that allowed federal regulators to freeze corporate assets. I realized that corporate power was an illusion, maintained by executive posturing, whereas regulatory authority was grounded in statutory law and objective documentation. I took detailed notes on statutory precedents, building a deep understanding of corporate liability that extended far beyond standard internal auditing. Eleanor observed my work silently, gradually entrusting me with sensitive file reviews and legal compliance cross-referencing. She frequently reminded our team that an auditor's strongest weapon is not anger, but a flawless understanding of regulatory leverage and statutory rules. As the months passed, I developed a reputation within our small regulatory division as an unshakable analyst, who never missed a footnote or an unverified signature. I examined hundreds of complex corporate disclosures, learning how shady executives attempted to hide liabilities behind shell companies and offshore holdings. I realized that the very systems corporate leaders used to exploit employees were rife with legal loopholes that could easily be turned against them. My understanding of federal acquisition law grew deeper each week, transforming me from a defensive internal auditor into a lethal statutory investigator. I began authoring internal research summaries on statutory noncompliance trends in high-tech corporate acquisitions. Eleanor Hughes reviewed my analysis and praised my ability to isolate hidden corporate risk factors. She noted that many acquiring firms overpaid significantly for corporate assets because their due diligence teams failed to inspect document edit histories and metadata trails. She encouraged me to keep refining my investigative techniques, assuring me that the regulatory field rewarded absolute precision above all else. 6 months into my tenure at the Federal Bureau, I was reviewing routine merger monitoring reports when a familiar name appeared on the regulatory tracking registry. Aection Technologies had entered early-stage negotiations for a massive buyout by Zenith Global Holdings, an international private equity conglomerate. The proposed transaction was valued at $380 million. The preliminary filing indicated that Aection was seeking an expedited regulatory clearance, claiming their internal compliance architecture was fully standardized and flawless. However, the federal filing lacked a verified external compliance audit signature, creating an immediate statutory pause under federal acquisition guidelines. Zenith Global Holdings required an independent, certified external compliance officer to lead the mandatory due diligence review before Phase 2 of the acquisition could proceed. Because of my extensive statutory background and my clean performance record at the Bureau, Eleanor Hughes put my name forward for the contract assignment. Zenith Global accepted the recommendation immediately. To ensure absolute objectivity during the audit, all official communications and statutory headers were issued under my registered legal name, Martin Vance. At Aection Technologies, everyone had known me simply as Marty, and my former personnel file had been archived under an old regional designation. Spencer Thornton and his executive team had no idea that the chief external compliance lead appointed by the buyer was the very same man they had discarded over a cheap laptop sleeve 3 years earlier. When Zenith Global issued my official digital credentials and handed me full administrative clearance to access Aection's internal compliance servers, I felt a calm, steady focus settle over me. I was not returning as an angry former employee seeking a shouting match. I was returning as an independent regulatory authority empowered by statutory law to inspect every single document, log file, and audit trail in their corporate repository. Before I initiated the remote server inspection, Eleanor Hughes called me into her private office. She looked at me over her reading glasses and reminded me that regulatory enforcement is not about personal emotion. It is about objective evidence and absolute legal precision. I assured her that I would let the documentation speak for itself. The moment I logged into Aection's internal compliance portal, using my high-level external auditor credentials, I recognized the structural layout immediately. The folder structures, naming conventions, and policy templates were identical to the ones I had personally authored during my 8 years with the firm. However, as I began pulling the digital metadata from the server repository, the extent of the executive misconduct became strikingly clear. Spencer Thornton and his nephew Chad Thornton had not simply taken over my department. They had engaged in systematic document manipulation and fraudulent misattribution of proprietary work. I opened the primary vendor risk assessment repository for the fiscal year following my termination. Dozens of master compliance templates that I had designed from scratch had been modified. The original author headers reading Martin Vance had been manually overwritten in the document properties to read Chad Thornton. Furthermore, multiple statutory risk evaluations that I had flagged as high risk had been retroactively altered. Digital timestamps revealed that on several occasions, user accounts belonging to Spencer Thornton had accessed the server at 2 in the morning to remove warning tags from unverified offshore vendor contracts. Despite their attempts to erase my presence from the system, their technical execution was remarkably sloppy. In dozens of core compliance spreadsheets and statutory policy drafts, my original embedded reviewer initials MV remained intact within the hidden XML metadata comments. under 17 U.S.C. Section 106, as well as federal corporate disclosure standards, retroactively altering document authorship to misrepresent corporate readiness constitutes material misattribution and legal fraud. Furthermore, transferring proprietary compliance frameworks to unqualified personnel while submitting falsified audit readiness statements to federal regulators violates 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. Over the next 4 days, I conducted a meticulous forensic audit of Aection server logs. I cross-referenced file modification histories, pulled IP access records, and compiled side-by-side comparisons of original statutory filings against the altered versions currently stored in the acquisition room. I discovered that Chad Thornton had approved over 24 non-disclosure agreements containing invalid legal language across multiple state jurisdictions, including California and Florida. These omissions left the company exposed to massive unhedged liabilities that had been completely concealed from Zenith Global Holdings during initial buyout pricing. I spent long hours methodically building side-by-side comparative matrices, mapping each altered document back to its original creation date. I tracked how Spencer Thornton had manipulated internal policy frameworks to justify allocating hundreds of thousands of dollars in performance bonuses to his nephew. Every altered paragraph, every deleted warning flag, and every overwritten timestamp was meticulously cataloged into my auditing software. The paper trail revealed a pervasive culture of executive arrogance, where management assumed that internal documents would never face rigorous independent inspection. Further investigation into the server archives revealed that Spencer Thornton had personally authorized payments to unverified third-party contractors without obtaining mandatory statutory clearances. These transactions were hidden behind vague administrative labels and placed in restricted directories. By comparing session logs with corporate banking transfers, I linked these unauthorized payments directly to executive bonus pools. It was a classic pattern of corporate embezzlement hidden beneath sloppy compliance accounting, designed to artificially inflate short-term profitability before the acquisition. I also discovered that several key intellectual property registration documents had been improperly altered to remove co-inventor credit from former engineering staff. This violated statutory requirements under federal patent disclosure laws and exposed the firm to severe retroactive licensing claims. Spencer Thornton had assumed that by burying these documents deep within restricted subdirectories, no external due diligence team would ever locate them. But having designed the folder architecture myself, I knew precisely where to look, instead of issuing an immediate public warning, which would have allowed Spencer Thornton to claim technical glitches or blame minor administrative errors. I carefully documented every single violation. I created an encrypted master evidence dossier containing 117 distinct statutory noncompliance items, complete with verified server timestamps, user identification logs, and statutory legal citations. I categorized each finding by its legal severity and its direct financial impact on the proposed buyout. Once the dossier was fully compiled and verified against federal audit standards, I prepared for the in-person executive review meeting at Aection's corporate headquarters. The weather was overcast on the morning. I returned to Aection Technologies Tower. I wore a tailored charcoal wool suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a dark silk tie. Pinned to my lapel was the gold-embossed regulatory clearance badge of Zenith Global Holdings. I carried a single leather briefcase containing 4 identical copies of my bound audit dossier. As I walked through the sliding glass doors into the main lobby, Angie Miller, the senior receptionist who had worked at the front desk for over a decade, looked up from her computer terminal. She began to speak her standard greeting, but her eyes locked onto my face and then dropped to the gold badge on my chest. She gasped quietly, freezing mid-sentence, recognizing me instantly, despite the sharp change in my posture and attire. I gave her a polite nod, walked past the security turnstile without scanning a visitor pass, and took the executive elevator directly to the 16th floor. When I entered the main executive boardroom, the room was already filled with Aection's senior leadership team. Spencer Thornton was standing near the head of the table, holding a mug of coffee and speaking animatedly to the chief financial officer. Evelyn Price was sitting near the center of the table with a stack of onboarding folders. Neither of them recognized me immediately as I walked in. The lead corporate counsel for Zenith Global Holdings stood up and introduced me to the room, announcing that Martin Vance, Chief External Compliance Officer, would be presenting the mandatory due diligence findings for Phase 2 of the acquisition. Spencer Thornton's smile vanished instantly. His face went completely pale as his eyes met mine, a sudden look of shock and panic flashing across his features as he connected my legal name with the officer he had forced out 3 years prior. Evelyn Price leaned over to the corporate secretary and whispered audibly that I was now representing the federal regulatory authorities. The atmosphere in the boardroom turned ice cold within seconds. I sat at the head of the conference table, opened my briefcase, and distributed the bound red folders across the polished mahogany surface. I began the briefing in a calm, measured tone, avoiding any personal comments or dramatic gestures. I directed their attention to page 4 of the dossier, which detailed severe statutory discrepancies in vendor license transfers across multiple state jurisdictions. I explained that under federal acquisition standards, unfiled amendments and backdated corporate agreements attach permanent statutory liability to the acquiring entity. Spencer Thornton attempted to interrupt, offering a nervous laugh and claiming that any minor documentation gaps were simply the result of department restructuring and corporate modernization. I did not argue with him. I simply flipped to the next section of the dossier and projected the digital server access logs onto the main presentation screen. The screen displayed clear evidence of late-night document overrides executed under Spencer Thornton's user credentials, alongside explicit proofs of document authorship falsification under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. I pointed out that master compliance matrices originally authored by my office had been fraudulently reattributed to Chad Thornton to justify executive bonus allocations. The room fell into absolute, stunned silence. Aection's general counsel stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing that these findings represented catastrophic legal exposure. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the board of directors immediately declared an emergency 24-hour procedural recess. During the recess announcement, Spencer Thornton attempted to approach me in the hallway, his posture defensive and his voice strained. He tried to suggest that we step into a private office to discuss an amicable resolution before the findings were formalized. He claimed that the document edits were mere operational misunderstandings and offered to adjust internal executive roles to accommodate my concerns. He even subtly hinted that a generous consulting fee could be arranged if the audit report was softened. I looked at him calmly and informed him that as an independent regulatory officer, all communications regarding active audit findings had to be conducted on the official record in the presence of federal corporate counsel, and that any attempt to influence an active audit constituted a separate statutory violation. He stared at me in stunned silence, unable to find words, realizing that his usual corporate tactics were completely powerless against federal statutory enforcement. I turned and walked out to my vehicle, leaving the executive team in complete disarray as they scrambled to consult their legal defense attorneys. During the 24-hour recess, executive panic swept through the upper management of Aection Technologies. Server access logs showed that corporate legal counsel worked through the night attempting to review the evidence dossier I had provided. However, because every finding was backed by immutable federal server, timestamps, and statutory cross-references, there was no possibility of covering up the violations. At 8 o'clock the following morning, the executive committee reconvened in the boardroom. The atmosphere was somber and tense. Spencer Thornton was no longer standing by the window. He sat quietly at the far end of the table, his eyes fixed on the floor, accompanied by an external defense attorney. I stood at the head of the table and opened the final statutory summary. I directed the board's attention to Section 14.2c of the Master Acquisition Agreement between Aection Technologies and Zenith Global Holdings. This statutory clause stipulated that any verified history of document falsification, material misattribution, or intentional concealment of regulatory risk would trigger an immediate 30% penalty reduction in the total purchase valuation. Furthermore, the clause mandated the immediate forfeiture of all executive retention bonuses and required the formal exclusion of implicated personnel from post-acquisition operations. I announced calmly that based on the verified audit evidence, Zenith Global Holdings was exercising Section 14.2C in full. The valuation of the acquisition was reduced instantly by 30%, dropping the buyout price from $380 million down to $266 million, wiping out over $114 million in expected shareholder value. Additionally, Spencer Thornton and Chad Thornton were formally disqualified from receiving any executive retention packages and were barred from holding any operational roles within the merged entity. The chief executive officer of Zenith Global Holdings signed the revised acquisition terms on the spot. He turned to Aection's board of directors and stated plainly that the transaction would only proceed under the reduced valuation and with the immediate removal of the implicated executives. Spencer Thornton sat frozen in his chair as the reality of his career destruction settled in. Evelyn Price looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly recalling the day she had docked my severance check for a cheap computer sleeve. I gathered my regulatory files, closed my briefcase, and informed the board that a complete copy of the audit dossier had been filed with federal regulatory oversight bodies for statutory review. As the meeting concluded, several board members approached me to express their gratitude for exposing the internal liabilities before the transaction finalized. They acknowledged that without the rigorous statutory audit, the merged entity would have faced tens of millions of dollars in federal enforcement penalties down the road. Spencer Thornton and Chad Thornton were quietly escorted from the building by security personnel, their executive careers effectively finished. The news of their disgraced departure spread quickly through the industry, permanently damaging their professional standings. I spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing the official transfer documents with Zenith Global's legal team. As I packed my briefcase for the last time in that 16th floor boardroom, I took a moment to look out at the city skyline. 3 years earlier, I had left that same building feeling humiliated and discarded over a cheap computer sleeve. Today, I was leaving with my professional integrity completely vindicated and statutory law upheld. As I walked out of the boardroom and headed toward the elevator, I felt a deep sense of professional closure. I had not broken a single rule, nor had I engaged in petty office politics. I had simply applied statutory law with absolute precision against those who believed they were above accountability. My cell phone chimed with a new calendar notification from Eleanor Hughes at the Federal Bureau, assigning me to lead an upcoming compliance audit for another major corporate entity, Pillar Bridge Capital. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the ground floor button, and smiled quietly as the doors closed.